If you've listened to this podcast for a while now, one of the things you might have noticed that I really like to talk about is life in space. And one of the more realistic possibilities for alien life is that it exists in the subsurface oceans of ice-encrusted worlds like Enceladus or Titan. I like to be optimistic about this kind of stuff, but sometimes a study will come out that rains on the parade. This is inevitable, as astrobiology is a largely speculative science, and new data can often have big implications for theoretical modeling and informed speculation. The reason for this preamble is because a recent study has made some calculations, and their estimates are not good for the potential for life. But this issue is a little more nuanced, and the study isn't flawless. When rock, like continental plates, are pulled apart, geologists will call this a normal fault, or a normal fault line. The geological processes are creating a valley, or a rift, between the separating masses of rock. When rock is pushed together and compressed, this can cause thrust faults. This takes more energy than a normal fault, because the rock surfaces are being pushed into each other. This creates very high pressure, and when the pressure suddenly releases because, for example, the strength of the rock couldn't hold up to the pressure anymore, the rocks will suddenly slip past each other, deforming the ground and releasing energy that can create earthquakes and volcanoes and other such geological features. However, it takes a lot of energy to build up this pressure in the first place, and if the energy just isn't there won't be this kind of geological activity. And when the surface is covered in ice and ocean that's literally miles deep, well, there's a lot of surface pressure on the underlying rock, pinning it down or weighing it down. And this means that it takes more energy for tectonic forces to move the rocks around, to break and crack the rocks and crush them all together, to create earthquakes and volcanoes and deep-sea hydrothermal vents and all of that good stuff. This is what the study analyzed. They calculated the strength of the rocky core that sits under the subsurface ocean of Europa, Ganymede, Enceladus, and Titan, and they made estimates as to the probability of geological activity. Paul Byrne is a planetary geologist at North Carolina State University, and he was the lead author of the study. Mr. Byrne said, quote, "I was hoping we could characterize what the chain of volcanoes would look like, what the rift zones would look like, and then we were like, well, I don't think they're going to be there," unquote. He went on to say, quote, "For Europa, it seems really hard to make any fractures or faults. And then, once you look at Titan and Ganymede, these numbers are stupid high. Really, nothing's happening at all on those worlds," unquote. The story is a little different for Enceladus, which is smaller and so has less water and ice weighing down on the rocky core. Enceladus also has a porous core, which could heat the water through friction and feed mineral nutrients into the water through erosion. And that is really the crux of the matter here. Do these worlds have enough geological activity to produce features like volcanoes or deep-sea vents that can feed mineral nutrients into the water? This would be critically important for life, because if these geological features don't exist, and these mineral nutrients aren't readily making it into the water, life is a lot more unlikely here. The moon Enceladus remains the odd man out, because there's a lot of data that suggests that Enceladus is friendly to life, including the late Cassini mission's findings that heavy organic compounds are being blasted out of its southern polar water plumes. But according to this most recent study's estimates, the other three worlds, Ganymede, Europa, and Titan, have rock that's too strong to fracture. The energy input is typically the tidal heating that's generated as Jupiter and Saturn's gravity flexes and warps their moons. But according to the researchers, they found that the tidal heating from these gas giants is not providing enough incoming energy to sufficiently break up the rocky cores. And because the rocky cores aren't being broken up and ground together and, mashed around to create all of these geological features, there just isn't enough energy to create deep-sea vents and volcanoes. so they might not exist at all. Mr. Byrne was kind of sad about his team's findings. He said, quote, "It would be great if we found interesting stuff, because these worlds are cool and maybe there's life there. But if we're right, it means we do need to reconsider these worlds as habitable destinations, or destinations for exploring habitability," unquote. If you're kind of disappointed and dismayed about this, as Mr. Byrne seems to be, there's reason to be hopeful. Remember that I said that this study wasn't flawless. Their calculations, and the articles describing their calculations, make no reference to the ductility and the strain of the rock, or the shear forces of the rock face. They also don't seem to have taken into consideration the local variations in ice density and thickness, which would play a role in subsurface geological activity. Their calculations actually seem rather simple, as they appear to have only used the moon's internal gravity and the tidal forces of the parent planet to make their estimations. But this means that their estimates are pretty rough. Beyond this study, there are other studies that have found compelling evidence for the habitability of the moons, particularly Europa. A recent NASA study found that Europa could have potential for life because of the ratio of oxygen to hydrogen in the oceans. And this availability of oxygen would be enough to support life, theoretically, even if there isn't enough energy to create volcanoes and deep-sea vents. A second study found that Europa has complex geological activity in its surface ice sheets, and this geochemical cycling of the ice could be highly supportive of life. So I guess what I want to say is that even with studies like this that discourage the idea of alien life existing in the moons of our outer solar system, the estimates were pretty rough, and there's a lot of data that points in the other direction. So the search for life is by no means over.